Our passage for this morning comes from Genesis 39, verses 1 through 23. It's in the middle of a long set of stories about Joseph. Joseph was his dad Jacob's favorite child, secret favorite child. Joseph had that long coat, a multicolored coat, you might remember. Joseph had delusions of grandeur. He was handsome. And you might be picturing Joseph in the amazing Technicolor dream coat, or Donny Osmond for all I know. Joseph. His brothers were sick of him, so they sold him as a slave. But God was with him. God had something in mind for him. Listen now to the scriptures. Now Joseph was taken to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, so that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer of his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And with him there, he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good looking. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am. Nor has he kept anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. And she kept his garment by her until the master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside.' When Joseph's master heard the word that his wife spoke to him, saying, 'This is the way your servant treated me,' he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. God gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
After a disappointing season of injuries in the NBA with the Pacers, Joe got traded to Cleveland, where he played for the Cavs under coach Tyrone Lue. Joe got healthy and was really successful in Cleveland. He improved his outside shooting and became known as one of the best defensive players in the league. Joe was grateful to God for his health, his height, and his ability to play the game he loves. He was also very thankful to Coach Lue for picking him up as a free agent so he could make great money as an NBA player. Coach Lue loved having Joe on the team. Lue saw that God was helping Joe to be successful in whatever he did.
Joe, I am glad that I signed you up for this season. Since you've joined us, we win more games and we've had a lot more fun together. This movie and pizza night is an amazing idea.
Oh, thanks, Coach. I'm just grateful to God for bringing me to you and to this great team.
Yeah, Joe, thanks. This was a great idea. I don't know why we didn't hang out before, but this is an awesome way to spend our nights off.
And the Special Olympics event you organized for us to host last week, wow, Joe, what can I say? That was a life-changing experience for me. I just love those high school kids and their buddies, best buddies. I would never in a million years have thought to do that, Joe, and I'm glad I did.
The whole city of Cleveland seemed to be blessed by God because of Joe. Coach Lue saw this and delegated everything he could to Joe.
Joe, I want you to organize all the team's charity fundraisers. I want you to do all our ESPN interviews. I want you to be the one to organize my kid's birthday party next month.
As you can see, Joe was well built and handsome. Coach Lue's wife noticed this. Everyone did. But she didn't stop at just enjoying Joe's eye candy. She thought that because she was Mrs. Tyrone Lue, that Joe would do whatever she wanted.
Come here, Joe, you cutie pie, you. While the rest of the team's enjoying that silly movie, come make love to me.
What? I'm sorry, ma'am. I think you're very beautiful. But I'm not gonna mess up this good thing I have going on with Coach Lue. I owe him my career, my life. Heck, he's given me everything except you. Because you are his wife. I won't sin against God and go to bed with you. It could ruin everything for me.
But the coach's wife wasn't one to take no for an answer. One day, Joe went to the coach's house to set up for a team dinner, and none of the rest of the team was there yet.
Joe, make love to me.
I'm out of here.
Joe ran out of the house, leaving her hanging on to his coat.
Oh, you'll pay for this. No one uses Mrs. Lue.
She called the Cleveland police, and when they arrived, she told them,
Look, this horrible man tried to rape me, but I screamed for help. And when he heard me, he ran out of the house, leaving his coat with me. Yes, officer, that Joe.
Later, when Coach Lue came home,
Tyrone, your favorite player, Joe, tried to rape me, but when I screamed for help, he left his coat and ran out of the house.
Coach Lue became very angry and made sure Joe got thrown into the same prison where all the criminals of Cleveland were sentenced to serve time. While Joe was in prison, God was good to Joe. He made the jailer like Joe.
Wow, Joe. You make coming to the work at the jail a real pleasure. I'm putting you in charge of everything we do here at the jail. Our athletics, our holiday visitations, our education, our rehab programs, literally everything. I won't need to worry about anything while you're here.
The Lord was with Joe and made him successful in all that he did.
The end. This is not the word of the Lord, but closely parallels the story from Genesis 39. If you want to know if Joe ever gets out of prison, or if justice is ever served to the conniving Mrs. Liu who abused her privilege, you'll have to check out Genesis 40 through 41, because the narrative lectionary has us only reading chapter 39 today.
There's a museum in Montgomery, Alabama. It's called the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration. It is in a building which originally was used to warehouse slaves, and it sits very close to an infamous slave auction block. At that museum, they have built an outdoor memorial specifically focused on lynchings. The memorial is made up of huge slabs, metal slabs, hanging in an open-air structure, hanging like floating tombstones, like lifeless bodies suspended from a tree branch. And on these slabs are inscribed the names and the dates of over 4,400 black men and women who were lynched between 1877 and 1950. Just over 4,000 of them were lynched in the South, about 300 elsewhere in the country, including in Indiana. There's a report that is written by the Equal Justice Initiatives that chronicles that grim history. Quote, "The terror lynchings were acts of terrorism because these murders were carried out with impunity, sometimes in broad daylight, often on the courthouse lawn. These lynchings were not frontier justice because they generally took place in communities where there was a functional criminal justice system, but was deemed too good for African Americans. Terror lynchings were horrifying acts of violence whose perpetrators were never held accountable. Indeed, some public spectacle lynchings were attended by the entire white community and conducted as celebratory acts of racial control and domination. The research found that most of these terror lynchings can be understood as having the features of one or more of the following. 1, lynchings that resulted from a wildly distorted fear of interracial sex. 2, lynchings in response to casual social transgressions. 3, lynchings based on allegations of serious violent crime. And it goes on for 3 or 4 more other reasons." Unquote. The story of these lynchings, then, it's not about sex. It's not about the law. It's not about economics. It's about racism. It's about white supremacy. It's about fear and causing fear. It's about power. It's about privilege. It's about a shocking injustice that was basically allowed to occur, and it was meant to terrorize. The argument which flows from here is that the legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow laws, this kind of domestic terrorism, the legacy is now baked into the culture of the United States, which has led to a system that has a systemic racist embedded into it, a pervasive racism. The motive behind the shocking spectacle of a lynching has been transformed to a more socially acceptable form, a mass incarceration which disproportionately affects African Americans and Latinos in our prisons today. People may simply tune out when they hear about mass incarceration. People may blame the prisoners. People may suppose all law enforcement is colorblind. All the while, avoiding this key question: is the system stacked up against them, and I just don't notice it because it doesn't impact me? We can read the Joseph stories in Genesis, especially the one in Egypt. And we can completely miss or disregard the systemic injustice that was taking place. After all, Joseph is a good guy. He's the hero, right? He's the one, he's a bit of a brat, but he's the one that keeps coming back and back again. He's the one that God favors. He's the one that bounces back. But what today's passage lays out in stark terms is that he was a slave. He was someone with no power. And someone who has nothing, someone who was nothing more than property. Property that could be toyed with, property that could be used. We might miss this because the story is quick to tell us how good-looking, how smart Joseph was. How Joseph was put in charge of all these things. He was in charge of the house. He lived in the house. He lived in the big house. But the recipe for disaster is familiar. The owner of the house wants to do as they please with a slave. Usually that involved the master raping the female slaves. Here, the genders of the owner and their slave are reversed, but not the cruelty. Joseph is harassed, he's wrongly accused, and then he's unjustly imprisoned. Sounds familiar? The power differential between the owner and the owned, between the Egyptian and the Hebrew, was not something which could be compensated, not even with Joseph being a good slave. In fact, Joseph would have faced certain death based on the accusation, and yet, incredibly, the force which disrupts the tragedy from ending in that is the presence of God, is the favor that God has for him. And so God disrupts that cycle, even if it ends up with Joseph in prison for some years. That may have been cold comfort for Joseph, still unjustly in jail. But in his ongoing saga, God would disrupt injustices against Joseph time and time again, from his brothers selling him into slavery, from the Egyptians who were powering over him. Again and again, God intervened. The Joseph stories are about God interfering and intervening on behalf of God's people. They are also the stories of immense odds against them and how God powerfully acts. Now, that can make us see a story like today's as a story of encouragement in the face of injustice. Keep hope alive. God will act. God will intervene. But I also think that the stories are marching orders for us as an audience. Marching orders for us to get on the right side of history, working to disrupt injustice, dismantling the power structure which keeps some at the top always and some at the bottom always. The categories may shift, but if you look at modern stories of injustice with the lens of the Joseph story, they'll become recognizable, because it will be clear who doesn't have the power and who does in a particular context. People of color, immigrants, women, Palestinians, refugees, LGBTQ folk, religious minorities, etc. Just look at the circus going on with the U.S. Supreme Court nominee, and an accusation in which the genders are switched from Joseph's stories, but the power dynamics echo similarly. Stories of injustice, historic or current, ought to stir a sense of holy outrage in us. But then again, there's a danger that they may blend to the background, that they might become just one more story on top of so many others that we might grow numb or blind to them. Or perhaps we move too cautiously, afraid we'll attract the negative attention that these forces of injustice will seek to battle us. But just remember, the battle against injustice has God on its side. In my mind echo the words Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once quoted, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Our call is to stand on the right side of history with courage and with faith that God will use us in the divine disruption of human injustice. Thanks be to God for God's word for us. Amen.